When my daughter left me that small folded note on the kitchen table, I did not understand why her hands were trembling or while she looked at me as if she was carrying a weight far too heavy for someone her age, and I remember watching her walk away without saying a word, just quietly adjusting her backpack like she always did before school, except that morning something in her movements felt careful, almost rehearsed, and even though the house was silent after she closed the door, I could still feel the echo of whatever she had wanted to say but couldn't bring herself to speak aloud. And as I stood there in the soft morning light, holding a note that seemed too light to hold the fear I saw in her eyes, I felt a strange tightening in my chest, like a warning I had ignored for far too long, a quiet whisper inside me saying that our family had been living with shadows that were finally ready to show their truth, and all I could think in that moment was that maybe I should have listened sooner, maybe I should have asked more questions, maybe I should have paid attention to the small things that now suddenly felt so loud. I held that note in my hand for a long time before opening it, almost afraid of what a few written words could change inside me, and the strange thing was that a part of me already sensed it would be something painful, something connected to the quiet moments I had brushed aside, the sudden silence when I entered a room, the way conversations in the family shifted whenever I asked simple questions, the hidden glances between people who once spoke openly, and as I finally unfolded the paper, my fingers shaking more than I wanted to admit, I felt the weight of years settling on my shoulders, because my daughter's handwriting was small and unsure, like she had rewritten the sentence several times before deciding this was the only way she could bring the truth to me, and reading her words felt like stepping into a room where all the lights had been turned on at once, too bright, too revealing, leaving no place for the secrets that had been quietly shaping our lives. And even though the note was short, just a single line, it carried the power to unravel everything I thought I understood about my family, my marriage, and the trust I believed was unbreakable. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just a message from my daughter. It was a plea, a hope that I would finally see what she had been seeing all along. Before that morning, when my daughter left the note, our home looked ordinary from the outside, the kind of house people drive past without ever imagining what story lives behind the walls. And for years, I believed our story was simple, steady, and familiar, the kind where we all moved through routines without questioning why certain moments felt heavier than others. And even though I often sensed a quiet tension rising between small interactions, I convinced myself it was normal family life, the sort of thing every household carried in its own quiet ways. I grew up believing that silence was a form of peace, that if people were not shouting or fighting, then everything must be fine. And that belief stayed with me well into my adult life, shaping the way I navigated my marriage, my motherhood, and the responsibilities that came with keeping a home together. But now, looking back, I realize silence can sometimes be the space where truths hide the longest. My husband, Daniel, was not a loud man. He was composed in a way that made people think he had everything figured out. And whenever we had guests, he carried himself with an ease that convinced others he was the steady center of our family. But there was a heaviness in him that only surfaced when we were alone, a kind of tiredness that didn't come from work or age, but from something deeper. And though I noticed it, I never asked about it because I didn't want to disturb whatever fragile balance existed between us. Our daughter, Lily, was always more perceptive than we gave her credit for, the kind of child who noticed emotions before words, who sensed shifts in tone even in casual conversations. And sometimes she would sit beside me quietly like she wanted to say something, but wasn't sure if I was ready to hear it. And even then, I would brush her hair behind her ear and tell her everything was fine, because that was the only answer I knew how to give. Life moved forward in predictable rhythms. Morning breakfasts, school routines, Daniel leaving for work, and me managing the home, checking grocery lists, folding laundry, listening to the hum of appliances as if they were the heartbeats of our daily life, keeping things steady because steady felt safe. But stability can be misleading, and sometimes the routines we cling to are the very things that distract us from seeing what is wrong. I remember evenings when Daniel came home later than usual, carrying an exhaustion he tried to hide beneath a forced smile, and he would sit at the dining table with a kind of distant look, as if part of him was somewhere else entirely. But when I asked if he was okay, he always answered, "Just tired." And I accepted that because accepting it was easier than digging deeper. Lily noticed it too. Children notice more than they are given credit for. And there were nights when she lingered near the doorway watching him with an expression that made me feel she understood something I didn't yet see. And sometimes I would catch her rubbing her fingers together nervously, a small habit she had when she felt uneasy. Still, I told myself she was just growing up, experiencing the natural confusion that comes with adolescence. And I never imagined she was carrying a truth heavier than the both of us combined. Our extended family played a role too, though I didn't see how significant their influence was until much later. My sister-in-law Maria visited often, bringing with her a kind of sharp warmth that always felt conditional, like she wanted to be supportive but also wanted to remind me of the ways she believed I fell short. And she had this way of commenting on the little things, how Lily dressed, how the house was arranged, how quiet Daniel had become, always phrased as observations but heavy with implication. Whenever she left, there was a silence that settled between Daniel and me, not the comfortable kind, but the kind that feels like unspoken questions floating in the air. And even though neither of us addressed them, they stayed, building themselves into invisible walls. I remember a particular afternoon when Maria took me aside to tell me that every family goes through difficult phases, but the way she said it made me feel she knew more about our phase than I did. And when I asked Daniel if he had spoken to her about anything personal, he just shook his head too quickly, like someone trying to close a door before the wind blew it open. There were other signs, too, small moments that slipped past me because I dismissed them as ordinary stress or misunderstandings. Days when Daniel would pause before answering a simple question. Nights when he stayed up later than usual, staring at his phone with a serious expression before setting it down too quickly when I entered the room. Weekends when he insisted he needed time alone to clear his head, and I assumed he meant work stress because that was the story we had always used to cover any discomfort. Even Lily's teachers had mentioned she seemed distracted at school, quieter than usual. And when I asked Lily about it, she simply said she was tired and didn't want to talk. And I respected that because I thought giving her space was the right thing to do. Now, I see it differently. I see how she was trying to carry something heavy on small shoulders, something she couldn't speak out loud because she feared it would break the fragile balance we were all trying to hold together. And yet, through all these signs, I kept telling myself our life was normal, that every family had its quiet tensions, and that as long as we stayed together, everything would eventually settle. I believe routines would heal what words could not, and I kept moving forward with a kind of blind hope that things would get better on their own. But the truth doesn't stay hidden forever. It waits. It watches. It finds its way into the moments we least expect. And for us, that moment came in the form of my daughter's trembling handwriting on a small folded piece of paper she left in the kitchen table, the place where her childhood drawings once lived, the place where I once believed nothing painful could ever be left behind. I remember sitting alone in the kitchen that same afternoon, long before I read the note, watching dust float softly through the light coming in from the window, and I kept thinking about how life had quietly changed without making any noise. How the small things I once ignored had grown into unspoken patterns that shaped the atmosphere of our home. And as strange as it sounds, I realized that the silence between us had become its own kind of language, a language I pretended not to understand because I didn't want to face what it might be saying. I thought about the nights Daniel and I used to sit together on the couch, talking about hopes and plans, and how those conversations had slowly turned into him saying he was too tired, and me answering with an understanding smile, even though deep down I felt something slipping away. I thought about Lily's childhood, how she used to run through the house with laughter that filled every corner, and how she would tug at Daniel's sleeve asking him to join her in a board game or a drawing session, and he used to say yes without hesitation. But we had reached a point where she rarely approached him anymore, choosing instead to sit quietly with her homework or retreat to her room. Looking back, I should have asked why she stopped trying, why her once bright energy dimmed whenever he walked into the room. But at the time, I convinced myself she was just growing up, experiencing the natural confusion that comes with adolescence. And I never imagined she was carrying a truth heavier than the both of us combined. I also thought about the day Lily came home early from a school event, saying the program ended sooner than she had expected. But when I later checked the school calendar, I saw the timing didn't match. And when I asked her again, she changed the subject quickly. I dismissed it then, thinking she might have simply misremembered. But now I wonder if she came home early because she needed to check something she feared was happening while she was away. And then there was the day Daniel told me he had a sudden work meeting, yet Lily insisted she saw him near her school around the same time. When I asked him about it, he brushed it off as coincidence, saying he was in the area for a different reason. And I accepted that explanation because I didn't want to create unnecessary conflict. But Lily looked at me afterwards with a sadness I didn't understand, as if she was silently pleading with me to look closer, to question more, to see what she could already see. All these moments came back to me in a rush the day she left that note, each fitting together like pieces of a puzzle I had refused to assemble. I realized then that Lily had been trying to tell me something long before she found the courage to write it down. She had been offering clues in the only ways she knew how, through questions left unfinished, through nervous glances, through changes in behavior I chalked up to adolescence. And when she could no longer carry the truth alone, she wrote it on paper, leaving it quietly in the place she knew I would find it, the place where we shared mornings, where she did her homework while I prepared her breakfast, where she felt safest, the kitchen table, the heart of our home, the place where truth finally arrived before I was ready. After reading Lily's note, I felt as though the ground beneath me had subtly shifted, a movement so quiet that at first I thought it was just my imagination. But soon I realized it wasn't the floor that moved, it was everything I had built my sense of family upon that was suddenly unsteady. And for the first time, I began to question things I had always assumed were safe and reliable. Things I had been told and had believed without hesitation, things I had wrapped myself in like a blanket of comfort. And as I sat there with the folded piece of paper trembling in my hands, I could feel a rising tension in the air of our home, the kind of tension that does not announce itself with shouting or slamming doors, but with the subtle pause of breaths, the slight hesitation in steps across a room, the quiet look someone gives when they are not sure if they should speak or even move, because the walls themselves seem to hold their own secrets. It was in that moment that I began to notice every detail I had once ignored, the uneven way Daniel's gaze met mine, the way he shifted when I asked simple questions about work or errands, the tightness around his mouth when he smiled, the little sighs he let out when he thought no one was listening, and I started to see that he had been carrying something heavy inside him for a long time, a burden he refused to speak about, a tension that Lily had quietly observed and that she was now sharing with me in her only way, through a short, trembling note that asked me to finally open my eyes to the truth. I realized that for weeks, maybe months, maybe even years, small moments had been building like cracks in a dam I refused to acknowledge. The little disagreements we had that never fully resolved, the cold silences that lingered after what seemed like ordinary conversations, the way Daniel sometimes stayed longer at work or disappeared into his phone in the evenings without explanation, the way Lily sometimes lingered near me with hesitation, as if she wanted to speak but feared what might happen if she did. And all of it came rushing back in waves of understanding that I had never allowed myself to feel until now. That night, the air of the house was different. It wasn't loud, but there was a heaviness that settled in every corner, making each room feel smaller than it had before. I tried to speak to Daniel, carefully choosing words that would sound ordinary, but every sentence felt inadequate. Every question seemed to reveal that I had been blind to signs he had hoped I would notice. "Daniel, did you know something was wrong?" I asked softly, my voice almost a whisper, because I didn't want to startle the reality that had quietly been forming around us. He looked at me with eyes that avoided mine for longer than usual, and finally muttered, I didn't know how to tell you," which was an answer I had not expected, and one that carried both relief and sadness, because I now understood that he had been protecting someone or something while inadvertently allowing a lie to grow in our family. Something Lily had sensed and something my daughter had now entrusted to me in the fragile form of a note. And in the silence that followed, I felt my heart pound, not with anger, but with a quiet fear. A fear born of knowing that the foundation of our family, the trust I thought was unbreakable, had cracks I could no longer ignore. Over the next several days, I began noticing patterns I had once dismissed. Daniel would leave for work earlier than usual, sometimes without saying goodbye, and return later than expected. And when I asked him, he would offer a vague explanation, always soft, almost apologetic, never entirely convincing. Lily became increasingly reserved, avoiding eye contact at times, retreating to her room, and I sensed she was wrestling with a burden too heavy to carry alone, a secret that weighed down the way she moved, spoke, and even breathed. I realized that she had been observing every interaction, every hesitation, every unspoken word between Daniel and me, and I felt a quiet ache knowing that her young mind had been processing truths I was only beginning to uncover myself. It was like walking through a house with hidden passages, each step revealing another layer I had never seen, each glance exposing corners I had overlooked, each sound carrying meanings I had been too preoccupied to understand. Conversations became more careful, measured, tentative, as though the note had shifted the very air between us, making it impossible to speak without sensing the weight of unspoken truths hovering over our heads. Even routine questions, how was your day? Did you finish your homework? Felt like traps that could reveal too much, and I found myself pausing before answering, thinking of the consequences of speaking too freely, of acknowledging too loudly what Lily had already hinted at. Daniel started staying home less frequently in the evenings, citing work and errands, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was trying to avoid something, or perhaps avoid facing me fully. When I attempted to discuss the note or the changes I had begun to notice, he would shift in his chair, his hands folded, eyes moving around the room as if searching for escape routes in a conversation that had nowhere to go but truth. And the more I tried to reach him, the more I realized how deeply entwined the lie had become, how long it had existed quietly in our lives, shaping actions, conversations, and relationships without my conscious understanding. Lily, meanwhile, remained close to me, but I could sense her anxiety growing, the small tremors in her voice when she asked questions, the hesitation before she spoke, and the careful way she placed herself between me and Daniel in certain situations, as if she was trying to protect me from truths she had only begun to grasp fully herself. And it was in these moments that I began to feel the first real pangs of regret, the heavy weight of knowing I had failed to see what had been right in front of me all along, and that the person carrying the clearest view of our situation was my own child, quietly observing, quietly judging, quietly waiting for me to understand what she already knew. Tension grew slowly but surely in small, almost imperceptible ways. Meals became silent affairs where forks clinked against plates in rhythmic, uncomfortable patterns. Words were chosen carefully, measured for neutrality, and yet each sentence carried undertones of suspicion, fear, or unresolved tension. There were afternoons when Daniel and I passed in the hallway without speaking, our eyes avoiding one another, the very air in the house humming with unspoken questions. And there were evenings when Lily would watch us, her brow slightly furrowed, her hands fidgeting with her sleeve, eyes darting between us as if she anticipated a storm she could already sense was coming. And I realized that our home had changed from a place of comfort into a delicate balance of hidden emotions, each one waiting for someone to disturb it, and someone always would. The note had opened a window I had tried to keep shut, and now the sunlight pouring through it revealed all the corners I had chosen not to examine, all the truths I had been avoiding, and all the tensions that were ready to surface quietly, inexorably, like a tide rising against the shores I thought were solid. I began to notice arguments where there had been none, subtle disagreements, moments of irritation that never reached their peak but left residue in the air, leaving the house heavy with unresolved emotion. Daniel would sometimes snap at small things, then apologize almost immediately, but I sensed it was not frustration over trivial matters. It was the tension of carrying a truth he had been suppressing, the same truth Lily had sensed long before I did. And when I tried to talk to Lily about her note, she would look away, biting her lip, hesitant, almost afraid of her own courage, afraid that speaking aloud might bring consequences she wasn't ready to handle. And I realized that our family had built invisible walls around ourselves, walls I had never noticed until they began to crack, revealing a landscape of misunderstandings, half-truths, and secrets that had been quietly shaping our lives for years. The more I observed, the more I understood that we were living in a delicate web, a structure so carefully constructed that any wrong move, any careless word could unravel it entirely. But the web was fragile not because of anything we had done recently, but because the foundation had always been built on silence, on assumptions, on unspoken fears. And now with the note in my hand and the awareness it brought, I could no longer pretend the walls of our home protected us. They confined us, keeping us from seeing each other fully and from confronting the truths that demanded to be spoken. In the days following the note, the subtle tensions in our home began to take on a life of their own, shifting from quiet observations into moments I could no longer ignore. And it felt as though every conversation, every glance, and even the routine sounds of daily life carried hidden meaning, a signal that something larger was at play, something that had been quietly forming beneath the surface of our family for years and now demanded attention whether I was ready or not.
Lily's behavior became increasingly guarded. She would linger in doorways, her hand resting lightly on the frame, hesitant to enter a room, hesitant to speak, and when she did, her voice was soft, cautious, measured, as if she were weighing every word for impact and consequence, and I realized that she was carrying the weight of knowledge I had failed to see, knowledge that had transformed her childhood innocence into a careful vigilance, a constant awareness that had begun to shadow her once bright presence in our home. Daniel, too, seemed aware that the note had disrupted the balance, although neither of us spoke openly about it. His movements were careful, almost deliberate, as though he feared saying too much or revealing more than he intended, and the way he lingered in corners of the house with thoughtful expressions suggested that he too had begun to sense the fragility of the trust we had built over years, the trust that now seemed to hang by threads barely visible to the naked eye. I noticed it in the way he would pause mid-step when I entered a room, the way he would shift in his chair, hands clasped tightly together, or the subtle tightening of his jaw when I tried to engage him in casual conversation. It was as though our home had become a delicate ecosystem, each of us moving cautiously, aware that one wrong word, one careless glance, could trigger a cascade of revelations we were not yet ready to face. The note had awakened me to patterns I had previously ignored. The small hesitations, the interrupted sentences, the gentle sighs at moments that should have been light. And suddenly, everything we had dismissed as ordinary stress or adolescent moodiness took on a new, heavy weight. I started keeping closer watch, not out of suspicion, but out of a desperate need to understand what Lily had been trying to tell me and to uncover what I had been blind to for so long. I found myself observing Daniel more carefully, noticing how he avoided certain rooms at certain times, how he sometimes picked up his phone only to set it down moments later, how he lingered in the window or in the garage as if he were processing something too significant to speak aloud. I realized that these behaviors were not random, not mere habits, but signals, signs of a deeper truth that had been silently influencing our family's interactions. And for the first time, I understood that my role as a mother, a wife, and the person who had believed she knew everything about her family had limitations I had never acknowledged. Even the way Lily moved through the house, the timing of her steps, the pauses she took before speaking to either of us became like a map of hidden tensions, each movement a breadcrumb pointing towards something we were all trying to avoid, something we had been collectively pretending didn't exist, but that the note had forced me to face head-on. There were moments of confrontation, though they were quiet, tentative, almost polite, as though the weight of our unspoken truth demanded delicacy. I tried asking Daniel gently about certain days, certain absences, certain odd behaviors I had noticed over the past months, and his answers were always measured, calm but incomplete, leaving behind more questions than reassurance. "I'm fine," he would say softly, his eyes not quite meeting mine, and I would nod, though inside I felt the creeping unease that had begun to take root. Lily would sometimes interject, not with accusations, but with hesitant observations, and I could see her struggling with the fear of speaking too loudly, of disrupting the fragile stability she had learned to maintain in our household. Each interaction felt like walking a tightrope suspended over invisible chasms, one misstep threatening to plunge us into an emotional abyss we had long avoided acknowledging. And yet the quiet nature of these confrontations did not make them any less powerful, any less transformative. For with every gentle exchange, every carefully chosen word, we were slowly confronting truths that had existed quietly for years, truths that demanded recognition if we were ever to regain any semblance of genuine connection or trust within our family. The tension extended beyond our immediate family into our interactions with extended relatives. Social visits that once felt natural now carried an undercurrent of scrutiny and unease. Maria, Daniel's sister, continued to comment in ways that felt almost like tests, small remarks that seemed innocuous at first but left me questioning my own perceptions, questioning whether I had missed something significant in our shared history. Daniel's parents, usually reserved but kind, began to exhibit subtle shifts in behavior as well, their actions now tinged with a guarded quality, perhaps aware of the shifting dynamics that the note had ignited. And throughout it all, Lily remained quietly observant, a witness to adult behavior she could no longer fully understand, but instinctively sensed was important.
Her watchfulness became a mirror reflecting the fractures I had once ignored, and the more I observed, the more I realized that we were all caught in a delicate dance of truth and avoidance, each of us balancing on the fine line between revelation and denial, between connection and estrangement. I found myself thinking constantly about the note, about the courage it had taken for Lily to write it, about the burden she had carried alone for so long, and about my own failures as a mother, as someone who should have seen, who should have understood, who should have protected her from the weight of secrets she should never have needed to bear. As the days unfolded, the emotional pressure within the house intensified. The quiet, subtle tensions began to manifest in arguments over minor matters, disruptions in routine that felt amplified because of the unspoken truth hovering over every interaction. Daniel would sometimes raise his voice slightly during disagreements, immediately apologizing afterward, his frustration never about the immediate issue, but rooted in the deeper burden of what had remained unsaid. Lily, meanwhile, exhibited signs of emotional strain, withdrawing from social activities, sitting alone in her room for longer stretches, or studying with an intensity that seemed more like a defense mechanism than genuine interest. I, too, felt the weight of responsibility more acutely, realizing that my attempts to maintain harmony had been superficial, temporary measures that now seemed inadequate in the face of a truth that demanded confrontation. And so each day became a careful negotiation, a balancing act of acknowledgement and restraint, of observation and careful questioning, as we all attempted to navigate the fragile terrain the note had revealed, knowing that at any moment one misstep could trigger a cascade of emotional upheaval we were not yet ready to face. By the end of this period, it became clear that the note had not just exposed a secret, it had shifted the entire dynamic of our family life. Every small interaction, every casual remark, every unspoken glance carried significance, and we were all now participants in a silent struggle to process what had been brought into the open. The rising tension was no longer a subtle presence in the background. It had become the defining feature of our days and nights, an invisible thread connecting us, straining us, and demanding that we either confront the truth together or allow it to fracture the family further. And through it all, Lily remained our quiet guide, the one who had forced us to see what we could no longer ignore, and whose courage and insight had illuminated the path to eventual understanding, even if that path was still fraught with uncertainty, fear, and unspoken pain.
It happened on a quiet afternoon when the sun had just begun to tilt through the windows in soft streaks of gold, casting long shadows across the floors that suddenly seemed heavier than usual. And I realized in that stillness that nothing in our home would ever feel the same again. The note, which I had kept folded on the kitchen counter, had stirred something long buried, something neither Daniel nor I could continue to ignore. And even Lily seemed aware that the moment had arrived when we could no longer hide behind hesitation, avoidance, or polite silence, that the truth we had danced around for years would now reveal itself in full force, whether we were prepared or not. I remember looking at Daniel across the room, noticing the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted momentarily to Lily before returning to me, and the small sigh he let out, one that carried both apprehension and a measure of relief, as if he had been holding back words that had grown heavier over the years, words that had been too painful, too complicated, or too terrifying to speak until this precise moment, when the atmosphere of our home seemed charged with inevitability, the kind of inevitability that makes the air itself feel dense, weighty, almost oppressive, and yet strangely clarifying, like a storm passing and leaving everything in sharper relief. Lily approached cautiously, holding herself as if she were balancing on a fragile ledge, her small hands folded in front of her, her eyes bright and alert, scanning both of us as though she wanted to be certain we were ready to hear what she had already seen and felt. And I could sense the quiet bravery she had carried for so long, the courage it had taken for her to leave that note, for her to hold on to the awareness of a truth we had all been tiptoeing around. And in that moment, I realized that our family could no longer function as it had before, that the walls we had built around ourselves would have to come down, and that facing the reality we had avoided was the only way forward. I remember Daniel finally speaking, his voice low, measured yet trembling slightly, a subtle vibration that betrayed the fear he had been carrying for years, and he said, "I never meant for it to get this far. I tried to protect you, to protect all of us."
and the words hung in the room, delicate and fragile, yet full of the weight of everything he had withheld, everything that had grown quietly between us like shadows stretching across the floors of our home. I felt my chest tighten as I listened, and though I had anticipated a confrontation, a revelation that might shatter the calm I had clung to, what came instead was a soft confession, a moment of quiet honesty that carried both pain and relief. And in hearing it, I understood that the lie or omission, whatever one wanted to call it, had never been born from malice, but from fear. Fear of hurting someone we loved, fear of breaking the fragile balance, fear that exposing the truth might undo everything we had built. And yet by hiding it, we had allowed distance, suspicion, and quiet anxiety to grow into walls thicker than any of us could have imagined. Lily watched silently, her eyes wide, absorbing every nuance, every inflection, every subtle sign that Daniel and I were now stepping together into territory that had once been forbidden. And I realized that her patience, her courage, and her quiet insistence in leaving that note had brought us to this point, to the moment when our family could no longer function in the shadows and had no choice but to confront the reality that had long been shaping our lives without acknowledgement. The confession revealed more than I expected. It was a story of misunderstanding, of secrecy meant to protect, but it had grown beyond control. Details came forth slowly, carefully, almost painfully, each revelation peeling back years of habits, conversations, and decisions that once seemed harmless but now carried a different weight. And as Daniel spoke, I began to see the connections between events I had dismissed as ordinary or coincidental, and the truth he had kept hidden, the way each choice, each omission had subtly influenced our family's dynamic, the way Lily had noticed what I could not, the way I had been blind in my attempt to maintain peace. I could feel the walls inside me breaking, but not in anger, rather in understanding, in the slow, aching clarity that comes when something long hidden finally surfaces. I realized then that the burden of this knowledge had been carried unequally, Daniel in silence, Lily in observation, and I in ignorance, and the imbalance had quietly shaped our family for years, creating patterns of avoidance, miscommunication, and subtle tension that none of us had fully recognized until this moment, until the note had opened the door and demanded that we face everything honestly and love. Each word, each pause, each hesitation carried significance, and I found myself listening not just with my ears, but with a kind of intuitive understanding, piecing together fragments of memory, subtle gestures, and quiet moments that had now taken on new meaning, forming a narrative I had not been able to see while living it. There were moments when I wanted to interrupt, to ask questions before he had finished, to demand clarity immediately. But I held back, realizing that the pace of revelation needed to be gentle, careful, like unwrapping fragile glass. And I watched as Lily shifted slightly closer to me, small fingers resting on the edge of the table, a silent anchor to remind me that we were in this together, that we were all navigating the same fragile landscape. And in that moment, I understood something crucial, that the strength of our family would not come from ignoring the truth or pretending it did not exist, but from facing it openly, with patience, with empathy, with love, and with the recognition that mistakes, misunderstandings, and omissions were human and could only be healed through acknowledgement, dialogue, and courage. I saw Daniel take a deep breath, and in that breath, I sensed not only the burden of years, but also the relief of finally speaking, the soft release of a weight that had been silently pressing upon him, a weight that had unknowingly affected Lily, me, and the quiet harmony we all longed to preserve. What followed were hours of quiet discussion, careful yet candid, each of us speaking in ways that were measured, not defensive, not blaming, but revealing, almost like tending a fire too small to light a house afire, but enough to warm us, enough to illuminate shadows that had lingered far too long. I realized that this was not just the uncovering of a lie or omission, it was the unveiling of a hidden landscape of emotions, of fears, of protective instincts gone astray, and it required patience to navigate, attention to understand, and openness to forgive. Lily contributed in her own cautious, insightful way, asking questions that were sometimes hard to hear but necessary, pointing out moments she had noticed that confirmed suspicions, clarifying what she had witnessed and what she had inferred. And in her quiet bravery, I saw the depth of her intelligence, empathy, and understanding, qualities I once took for granted and now marveled at in the same breath as I mourned the fact that she had carried such weight alone for so long. The room was heavy with revelation, but it was not suffocating. Instead, it was transformative, a crucible that was burning away pretense, avoidance, and misunderstanding, leaving only the raw human elements of truth, courage, and love. By the end of that afternoon, it was impossible to ignore the change. The note, the conversation, and the confessions had shifted the family's equilibrium in profound ways. We could not return to the old normal. That life had been irrevocably altered by honesty, by the courage of a child, and by the willingness of a father to finally speak. Yet within this upheaval, there was the glimmer of hope, the realization that we could rebuild, that we could reconnect, that we could navigate the aftermath of revelation with compassion and patience. I understood, perhaps for the first time fully, that family is not merely the sum of shared routines, holidays, and cohabitation, but the sum of courage, trust, and the willingness to face the truths that shape us, however painful, however frightening. And that day marked the beginning of that journey, a journey that would be long, careful, and reflective, but necessary for the healing of our hearts and the preservation of the bond between parent and child, between husband and wife, and within the family as a whole, all made possible by a single note, a small, trembling piece of paper that carried a weight far greater than its size would suggest, a note that exposed what had long been hidden and demanded that we, finally, meet it with honesty, love, and the willingness to change. As the days passed after that afternoon of confessions and revelations, the weight of the truth began to settle into our lives, not as a sudden collapse, but as a quiet, persistent presence that forced each of us to reconsider our words, actions, and assumptions. And I realized that the turning point was not a single moment of confrontation, but a series of small, delicate adjustments in behavior. Small acknowledgments and quiet realizations that together reshaped the way we interacted with one another. Like water gradually reshaping stone over time, gentle but unstoppable, persistent and transforming, and I found myself reflecting on the years we had lived unaware, or perhaps unwilling, to notice what had been in front of us all along. The small signs of tension, the quiet moments of discomfort, the subtle ways in which Lily's eyes would search for answers in my face, or the way Daniel sometimes carried himself as though weighed down by invisible burdens, all of which I had failed to interpret correctly, all of which now demanded recognition and understanding, and all of which became impossible to ignore in the wake of the note and the ensuing conversations. I watched Lily navigate the house with newfound caution, but also with a quiet pride, as if she had finally been given permission to exist in a space where her observations were acknowledged, where her voice mattered, and where her courage in leaving that small piece of paper had not gone unnoticed. And I felt a surge of both relief and sorrow. Relief that the truth was finally emerging, and sorrow for all the moments she had carried this burden alone, for all the time she had looked to me for guidance and found only the comforting illusion of stability I had tried to maintain. The truth, once revealed, did not bring chaos, but demanded careful attention, patience, and an openness that had been long absent from our family dynamic. And it was in navigating this complex emotional landscape that I began to see the power and the fragility of honesty, the way it could simultaneously wound and heal, and how our choices in responding to it could define the future of our relationships. Daniel began to open up in ways I had never seen before, speaking quietly in moments when the house was still, revealing pieces of his own fears and regrets, the things he had withheld for years, not out of malice, but out of a misguided attempt to protect those he loved. And in his confessions, I began to understand the depth of his own struggle, the pressure he had felt to maintain peace, and the weight of secrets he had carried silently, believing that shielding us from them would keep the family intact, not realizing that silence could grow into its own form of deception, shaping perception, influencing behavior, and creating emotional distance that we all now felt acutely. Lily listened in these moments, her expression a mixture of apprehension and understanding, sometimes interjecting softly with questions that were careful, respectful, and precise, seeking clarification, seeking assurance. And in her eyes, I saw the intelligence and emotional acuity that had allowed her to perceive what the adults around her had missed, the kind of insight that comes from both innocence and observation. And it humbled me in ways I had not anticipated, forcing me to recognize that parenting is not simply about teaching or guiding, but also about learning, about listening, and about being willing to confront one's own blindness, fears, and assumptions in order to truly protect, support, and nurture the children we love. The house, once filled with quiet tension and subtle avoidance, now carried a different energy, one that was still cautious, still measured, but also charged with the possibility of connection, the possibility of understanding, and the possibility of repairing the fractures that had grown so slowly, almost imperceptibly,
until the note had illuminated them fully. There were difficult moments as well, moments where emotions ran high, where regrets surfaced, where the past was examined in painful detail, and where we all had to face the consequences of choices we had made or ignored for years. Yet within these challenges, there was also growth. A gradual softening of walls, a willingness to listen more carefully, to speak more openly, and to acknowledge the humanity in one another, including our own. I began to notice small gestures that previously seemed ordinary, but now carried profound significance. Daniel making an extra effort to include Lily in conversations, checking in on her quietly after school, pausing to notice her reactions to things he once overlooked, and I myself became more intentional in my words, more patient in my responses, more present in the moments we shared, striving to demonstrate that acknowledgement, understanding, and love were not simply abstract ideas, but practical, lived experiences that required effort and attention every day. Lily's confidence grew as well. The courage she had shown in leaving the note seemed to ripple outward, shaping her behavior, her willingness to speak, her desire to contribute to the conversation, and her ability to observe, reflect, and respond in ways that were both mature and insightful beyond her years. In witnessing this transformation, I felt both pride and humility, recognizing that the youngest member of our family had been the catalyst for change, the spark that forced honesty, reflection, and growth upon us all, and that her actions reminded me of the delicate, interdependent nature of familial relationships, where even small acts of courage can create profound ripple effects. As the days stretched into weeks, the initial tension slowly transformed into a cautious equilibrium, one in which truth and honesty were no longer feared but welcomed, not without hesitation, but with intention, with care, and with empathy. Conversations that had once been avoided became possible. Interactions that had been strained now carried nuance, patience, and understanding. And moments of shared vulnerability, previously rare, began to occur naturally, almost imperceptibly, weaving new threads of trust into the fabric of our daily life. Daniel and I began to speak more openly about our own fears, regrets, and hopes, creating space for dialogue that had been missing for years. And I witnessed Lily navigating these moments with grace, attentiveness, and emotional intelligence, offering insights or simply listening. And in doing so, reinforcing the value of patience, courage, and thoughtful observation. It was clear to me that the turning point was not a single dramatic confrontation, but a series of small, intentional steps guided by honesty, reflection, and the bravery of a child who had refused to let her family continue in ignorance, and that these incremental actions, repeated consistently, had the power to reshape our relationships, to restore trust, and to create a foundation for future connection that was both authentic and resilient. The note had done more than reveal a hidden truth. It had illuminated the path forward, showing us how to navigate the complexities of love, protection, and communication in a family where mistakes had been made and where healing required not only acknowledgement but also sustained effort and conscious intention. By the end of this period, I realized that our family had begun to emerge from a long shadow, one cast not by malice but by fear, silence, and misunderstanding, and that while the process was far from complete, there was now a clarity that once seemed impossible, a recognition of the importance of observation, empathy, and honesty, and an understanding that courage can manifest in many forms, including a small folded note left on a kitchen table, trembling in the hands of a child who simply wanted her family to see what she saw, to hear what she had been trying to communicate, and to acknowledge what had been silently shaping our lives. The house no longer felt heavy in the same way. It was filled with cautious optimism, a quiet awareness that we were all learning, all growing, all adjusting to the reality that had been revealed, and all participating in the delicate ongoing work of rebuilding the trust, communication, and connection that formed the heart of family life. And I knew in that stillness and reflection that the turning point had arrived, that change was inevitable, and that the journey towards understanding, forgiveness, and renewal had truly begun, led by the brave, perceptive, and wise heart of my daughter, whose note had changed everything.
In the days that followed the turning point, I noticed a subtle but profound shift in our home, one that didn't arrive all at once but crept into our routines quietly, like sunlight filtering through curtains at dawn, softening the edges of tension, easing the unspoken heaviness that had hung in the air for years. And I began to see, with a clarity I had never possessed before, how the courage of a single child, expressed through a small folded note, could reshape the rhythm of an entire household, not through confrontation or anger, but through gentle insistence, observation, and an unwavering desire for truth, a desire that forced each of us to reconsider our own choices, assumptions, and behaviors. Daniel and I began to approach each other with patience we had not used in years, careful not to let the ghosts of past misunderstandings dominate our words, and yet willing to speak openly about our own fears, regrets, and intentions, creating a dialogue that had previously seemed impossible, one that encouraged acknowledgement without blame, reflection without judgment, and a deepening of empathy that allowed us to see each other not just as partners navigating daily life, but as human beings carrying complex emotions, mistakes, and vulnerabilities, all of which had been buried beneath layers of habit, silence, and avoidance, and which now demanded recognition, respect, and careful understanding. Lily, of course, continued to play a quiet but central role in this new dynamic, her presence a reminder of both the fragility and the resilience of family ties as she navigated each day with a confidence born of knowing she had been heard, a wisdom beyond her years reflected in her questions, her observations, and the gentle way she encouraged honesty and openness, all of which we shaped the interactions between Daniel and me, as well as the broader atmosphere in our home. I found myself marveling at the delicate complexity of family life, at how small gestures of courage and honesty could unravel patterns of misunderstanding and gradually weave new threads of trust. And I realized that the process of resolution was not a sudden fix, but a careful, intentional rebuilding, a daily practice of listening, acknowledging, and responding with care, love, and patience, and that this work, though exhausting at times, was the foundation for the healing and connection that we had been missing for far too long. Each morning, I noticed that conversations flowed differently, that silence was no longer oppressive but could be reflective, a space for thought rather than avoidance, and I could see Daniel making an effort to reconnect with Lily in ways that were gentle, patient, and intentional, whether it was sitting beside her at the kitchen table as she worked on homework, asking about her day with genuine curiosity, or pausing to notice the small emotional cues that had once gone unnoticed. And through these actions, I began to feel the subtle rebuilding of trust, the reconstruction of relationships that had once seemed fractured beyond repair. And I recognized that while our family was not perfect, we were moving towards something real, something resilient, something that acknowledged the past while creating space for growth, understanding, and renewed connection. The small, careful gestures of reconciliation extended beyond simple communication. They included physical presence, attentive listening, shared activities, and the conscious choice to prioritize understanding over assumptions, to prioritize love over defensiveness, and to prioritize courage over fear. And I realized that these choices, though simple in execution, carried enormous weight in restoring the emotional fabric of our family, binding us together in ways that were gentle yet unbreakable, and that the note, simple as it was, had been the catalyst for this transformation, the spark that ignited the careful and intentional work of resolution that we now embarked upon together. There were difficult moments as well, moments when past hurts or misunderstandings resurfaced, when old patterns of avoidance or silence threatened to creep back into our interactions. But the difference now was that we addressed them calmly, honestly, and with empathy, rather than allowing them to fester unnoticed. I remember one evening when a disagreement arose over something minor, a scheduling conflict, a forgotten task, but instead of escalating, Daniel and I approached it with measured words, each of us listening carefully, acknowledging the other's perspective, and working together to find a solution. And I realized that this simple act of mindful communication was a direct result of the emotional shift that had begun with Lily's note, a tangible proof that honesty and courage could reshape not just our understanding, but our behavior, our decision-making, and our capacity for empathy, patience, and connection. Lily, witnessing this, seemed to carry a quiet satisfaction in seeing that her actions had made a lasting difference, that her courage had been honored, and that our family was beginning to function in a way that was healthy, nurturing, and emotionally intelligent. And I felt a surge of gratitude, both for her insight and bravery, and for the opportunity to rebuild, to reconcile, and to reestablish bonds that had long been weakened by silence, fear, and misunderstanding. Over time, these small moments accumulated into a larger transformation. Meals became shared experiences of conversation, laughter, and genuine attention, rather than spaces of quiet tension or avoidance. Evenings were spent with a sense of presence and mutual respect, rather than hesitation or anxiety. And the entire atmosphere of our home gradually shifted from one of cautious vigilance to one of intentional connection, warmth, and care. I noticed Daniel taking active steps to rebuild his relationship with Lily, including asking her opinion on small family decisions, inviting her into conversations he had previously kept separate from her, and simply being more present in her daily life, offering support, guidance, and companionship, all of which contributed to a sense of emotional balance and stability that had been absent for far too long.
I too became more mindful, not just of my own responses and words, but of the ways in which I could foster trust, understanding, and openness, not through grand gestures, but through consistent, thoughtful actions, the accumulation of which began to create a new emotional foundation for our family, one rooted in honesty, empathy, and the willingness to confront truths rather than hide from them. And I realized that this slow, deliberate process of resolution was the true work of resolution, far more powerful and enduring than any single dramatic moment or confrontation could have been. By the end of this period, I felt a quiet but profound shift within myself. I had learned to listen more attentively, to observe more closely, to trust both my instincts and the insights of my daughter, and to approach challenges with patience, understanding, and empathy rather than avoidance, defensiveness, or fear. I realized that true resolution was not about erasing the past, hiding mistakes, or pretending that challenges never existed. It was about acknowledging them fully, confronting them honestly, and choosing to respond with intention, compassion, and love. The house, once filled with subtle tension, now felt lighter, warmer, and more welcoming, not because the past had disappeared, but because we had begun to face it together, openly and with courage. And I understood with a deep sense of relief and gratitude that the note, that small trembling piece of paper, had done far more than expose a hidden truth. It had created the conditions for healing, reconnection, and emotional growth that would guide us forward, shaping the way we communicated, related to one another, and loved one another in ways that were both lasting and deeply meaningful. It was a quiet, enduring kind of transformation, one that did not demand fanfare or recognition, but one that carried the weight of true understanding, patience, and the resilience of family bonds nurtured through honesty, empathy, and courage.
As the days and weeks continued, the subtle changes in our home became more pronounced, not through sudden gestures or dramatic confessions, but in the way we moved around one another with greater awareness, patience, and kindness, each action carrying a quiet intention that slowly replaced the tension we had lived under for so long. And I noticed that the presence of honesty and acknowledgement had begun to cultivate an emotional safety I had not realized we were missing, a safety that allowed each of us, Daniel, Lily, and myself, to express feelings without fear of judgment or misunderstanding, and to listen without defensiveness, creating a rhythm of communication that was both gentle and deliberate, yet profoundly transformative. I began to observe subtle signs of this new equilibrium everywhere. Lily speaking more openly about her thoughts, asking questions without hesitation, and contributing insights that were met with thoughtful consideration rather than dismissal. Daniel pausing before reacting to ensure his words were measured, his attention focused on fostering understanding rather than asserting authority. And I myself learning to slow down, to process my emotions fully before responding, and to acknowledge both my own mistakes and the unspoken burdens of those around me, recognizing that our family's emotional health required consistent effort, reflection, and empathy, all of which were now being cultivated in ways that felt natural, meaningful, and lasting. These changes, though gradual, carried immense significance because they marked the shift from living in the shadow of secrecy, avoidance, and unspoken assumptions to inhabiting a space of authenticity, trust, and emotional presence, where the weight of past misunderstandings could be addressed, acknowledged, and healed, and where we could begin to imagine a future that was no longer constrained by fear, silence, or avoidance. Even the smallest routines began to take on new meaning. Meals were no longer hurried or quiet, filled with polite nods and fragmented conversation, but instead became moments of intentional engagement, opportunities to share experiences, thoughts, and feelings without fear of judgment or dismissal. We laughed more often, sometimes at things that had once felt trivial, but each shared smile carried a deeper resonance now, a quiet acknowledgement of our resilience, our growth, and our willingness to face one another with openness and trust. Daniel began taking time in the evenings to sit with Lily and talk about her day, guiding her gently while also listening attentively, validating her observations, and encouraging her to share her thoughts and feelings freely. And I watched these moments with a mixture of gratitude and humility, realizing that the transformation in our family dynamic had been catalyzed by her small act of courage in leaving that note, a reminder that sometimes the youngest voices in a family can hold the most profound insights, and that the strength of a child's perspective when acknowledged and respected can foster healing that adults alone might never achieve.
I myself began participating more actively, not just as a mother and a wife, but as a listener, observer, and participant in this renewed emotional flow, offering encouragement, understanding, and presence that helped reinforce the changes taking place around me. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, a sense of trust, connection, and mutual respect began to permeate our home, altering not only interactions, but the very feeling of being together, of sharing space, of belonging. There were still moments of tension, naturally, remnants of old habits and unspoken fears, but now, rather than letting these moments grow into misunderstandings, we approach them deliberately, acknowledging the discomfort, expressing our feelings calmly, and working together to restore clarity and understanding. For instance, Daniel and I occasionally disagreed about routines or responsibilities, but instead of allowing irritation to escalate, we spoke gently, listened attentively, and addressed the issue with both empathy and patience, recognizing that our collective growth required ongoing attention, conscious effort, and the willingness to remain vulnerable with one another. Lily, witnessing these moments, seemed to internalize the lesson of constructive communication, learning that expressing concerns with honesty and kindness could lead to understanding rather than conflict, and her continued presence as both observer and participant reinforced the delicate but powerful thread of trust and openness now weaving our family together. It was in these small, repeated interactions that the true depth of resolution revealed itself, not in grand gestures, dramatic apologies, or instantaneous forgiveness, but in the everyday practice of patience, empathy, attentiveness, and honest engagement, which cumulatively reshaped the emotional climate of our home and fortified our relationships with one another. I also noticed that the environment of the house began to change in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. Spaces that had once felt heavy, quiet, or guarded became lighter, more open, filled with warmth and attention. And I realized that this shift was not simply emotional but physical in the way we carried ourselves, spoke, and interacted within the spaces we shared. Daniel and I began coordinating small family activities again, sharing simple experiences like walking together after dinner, preparing meals as a team, or reading with Lily in the evenings, each act reinforcing our renewed connections and reminding us of the value of shared presence and intentional participation. The house no longer carried the faint but persistent tension of avoidance or misunderstanding. Instead, it resonated with attentiveness, quiet care, and a growing sense of safety where each member could exist authentically without fear of judgment or dismissal, and where the lessons of past mistakes, of hidden truths, and courage in the face of silence were honored, remembered, and woven into our daily lives. In these moments, I understood that resolution was not a destination, but a process, a living, breathing practice of empathy, honesty, and courage that required continuous nurturing, and that the note, small and unassuming though it had seemed, had ignited a transformation that neither Daniel, Lily, nor I could have initiated alone, but together we were sustaining and expanding with intention, love, and awareness. By the end of this period, I felt a profound sense of quiet peace, not because all challenges had vanished, but because we had begun to navigate them together with honesty, compassion, and intentionality. I realized that the resilience of a family does not lie in the absence of mistakes, misunderstandings, or hidden truths, but in the willingness to confront them collectively, to communicate openly, and to approach each other with patience, empathy, and love. And that these choices, repeated over time, create a foundation of trust and connection that is far stronger than the avoidance or denial we once relied upon. Lily continued to serve as both a reminder and a guide, her courage and insight inspiring us to sustain our growth and practice honesty. And I felt gratitude for her bravery, for Daniel's willingness to speak, and for the opportunity to rebuild, reconnect, and reimagine what it meant to be a family together. The air of our home, once heavy with the unspoken, now carried the soft, steady warmth of reconciliation, understanding, and mutual care, a quiet but powerful testament to the transformative power of courage, honesty, and persistent, mindful attention. And I understood fully that resolution was not about erasing the past, but about embracing it, learning from it, and using it as a foundation for a stronger, more connected, and deeply human future.
As the weeks and months unfolded after the resolution began to take root, I found myself reflecting quietly on the journey that had brought us to this place, a journey that had started with a single, trembling note left by my daughter, a simple piece of paper that carried the weight of truth, courage, and insight, and I realized that the note had done far more than expose a family secret. It had catalyzed the slow, deliberate work of emotional rebuilding, the kind of work that cannot be rushed, cannot be forced, and cannot exist without patience, empathy, and the willingness to face oneself and one another with honesty and humility. I watched Lily with admiration, her small, perceptive eyes now softened by relief, her presence carrying a quiet confidence that had been nurtured through both her courage and our willingness to listen, and I marveled at how much a single act of bravery could ripple outward, shaping not only our perceptions but our actions, our interactions, and the emotional foundation of our home, which now felt lighter, warmer, and infinitely more present than it had before, carrying the subtle, enduring energy of truth acknowledged, mistakes confronted, and relationships nurtured with intention. Daniel, too, had transformed in ways that were gentle but profound, his approach to family life infused with a quiet mindfulness, a patient attentiveness, and a willingness to engage emotionally, all of which had been cultivated through our shared experience of uncovering, confronting, and processing the truths that had long been hidden. And I understood that his growth, like mine, was not about perfection or immediate change, but about the consistent choice to act with awareness, empathy, and care, reinforcing the lessons we had learned and ensuring that the bonds between us, though once strained, would continue to strengthen over time. I noticed how our interactions, once measured and cautious, had become more natural, more authentic, and more intentional, each gesture of attention, each shared conversation, and each act of quiet presence reinforcing the emotional foundation we had painstakingly reconstructed. And in these moments, I felt a profound sense of gratitude, not only for the courage and insight of my daughter, but also for the willingness of every member of our family to engage with the process of understanding, growth, and reconnection. I began to recognize that this ongoing process of rebuilding, of resolution, was not simply about addressing past mistakes or acknowledging hidden truths. It was about cultivating an environment where emotional honesty, empathy, and trust could thrive, where mistakes could be discussed without judgment, where courage could be nurtured rather than suppressed, and where every small act of attention, care, and reflection contributed to a lasting sense of safety, belonging, and love. Even the smallest routines now carried meaning, from shared meals where conversation flowed naturally and laughter arose easily, to quiet evenings spent reading, walking, or simply sitting together in silence, each moment reinforcing the connections we had rebuilt and the trust we had painstakingly restored. Lily's presence, so central to the turning point and resolution of our family's challenges, continued to shape our interactions, reminding us that courage, observation, and honesty could illuminate even the most hidden corners of family life, and that the youngest members of a household often carry perspectives that are both insightful and transformative, capable of guiding the entire family toward a healthier, more connected way of being. I found myself thinking often about the note, about the courage it had taken for her to write it, and about how a small, thoughtful act could serve as a catalyst for profound, enduring change, not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontation, but through quiet insistence, careful observation, and the willingness to speak truth in love. Over time, I noticed that our home had shifted in its very essence. The spaces we shared felt lighter, infused with warmth, attentiveness, and an energy that reflected our renewed connections, our intentional communication, and the subtle but powerful transformation of our emotional lives. Daniel and I spoke more openly, more patiently, and more mindfully, creating moments of dialogue that nurtured trust, understanding, and mutual respect, while also modeling for Lily the value of honesty, courage, and vulnerability. She in turn responded with insight, thoughtfulness, and continued bravery, offering observations and reflections that were met with genuine attention and care, reinforcing the cycle of trust and emotional growth that had begun with her simple note. I began to see that the act of listening, of paying attention, and of responding with empathy could be just as transformative as speaking, that the willingness to hold space for another's perspective, even when difficult or uncomfortable, was a critical foundation for healing and connection, and that these choices, repeated day after day, formed the true backbone of a resilient, loving family. In these moments, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment, not in terms of perfection, but in the sense that we were moving forward intentionally, consciously, and with love, embracing the challenges of family life, while also honoring the lessons of honesty, courage, and patience that had emerged from our shared experience. I also began to reflect more deeply on my own role in the journey. I realized that while Lily's note had sparked the change, and Daniel's willingness to speak had sustained it, my ability to observe, listen, and respond with care had equally been crucial in nurturing the emotional healing that followed.
I understood that being a parent, a partner, or a member of a family is not always about having the right answers or maintaining a facade of calm and control, but about being present, being attentive, and being willing to face difficult truths with courage and empathy, even when it is uncomfortable or painful. I saw how much growth had occurred within me, how my awareness of subtle emotional cues had sharpened, how my patience had deepened, and how my ability to foster connection had expanded, all because we had confronted the truths that had previously remained hidden, and because we had committed ourselves, individually and collectively, to rebuilding trust, communication, and understanding. I also realized that the process of emotional repair is ongoing, never truly complete, but that every small step, every intentional choice, and every act of empathy and honesty adds to a cumulative strength that sustains family bonds over time, creating a foundation that is resilient, enduring, and deeply human. In the quiet evenings, I often pause to observe the simple beauty of our renewed connection. Daniel helping Lily with homework, her small hand resting on his arm as they discussed a problem, the soft laughter that arose naturally during dinner, the small, thoughtful gestures that each of us began to notice and appreciate, from a warm glance to a gentle word of encouragement. And I understood that these moments, seemingly ordinary, were the tangible evidence of transformation, proof that honesty, courage, and empathy could reshape not only relationships but the emotional fabric of a home. I reflected on how far we had come, from a household shadowed by secrets, fear, and avoidance, to one illuminated by trust, attentiveness, and quiet courage. And I felt a sense of calm satisfaction, not as an endpoint, but as a recognition that the work of love and connection, though continuous, was now guided by intention, understanding, and respect. I understood that family is not defined by perfection, by flawless communication, or by the absence of mistakes, but by the willingness to confront, to learn, to forgive, and to grow together, creating an enduring bond that survives errors, misunderstandings, and even the quiet burdens of unspoken truths. And as I looked at Lily, her small perceptive eyes meeting mine with both pride and affection, I realized that the journey we had undertaken together had not only healed our family, but it also taught me profound lessons about patience, courage, empathy, and the transformative power of listening. The note, a simple piece of paper carried by a brave child, had sparked the slow, deliberate work of connection, honesty, and understanding, and it had reminded me that love is not merely an emotion, but a practice, one that requires attention, courage, and intentional effort to sustain and nurture, and that by embracing this practice, we could move forward with hope, clarity, and quiet joy, building a family life grounded in truth, compassion, and the enduring power of human connection, one thoughtful choice, one honest conversation, and one courageous act at a time.
As the months passed, I found myself reflecting more and more on the journey our family had traveled, from the quiet tension and hidden truths that had filled our home for years, to the small, courageous act of a note that illuminated what had long been left unspoken, to the painstaking, deliberate work of rebuilding trust, understanding, and connection. And I realized that the most profound transformations often begin with the simplest gestures, the quietest voices, and the acts of courage that go unnoticed by many but carry immeasurable weight for those who witness them. Lily's bravery in leaving that note had not only forced the family to confront difficult truths, but it also inspired a culture of attentiveness, empathy, and intentional communication that now permeated our daily lives, shaping how we spoke to one another, listened, and responded, reminding me that the true work of family is never done in a single moment, but in the countless small choices we make to be present, to acknowledge, and to care for one another with consistency, love, and patience. I noticed with quiet gratitude how Daniel had grown in subtle yet profound ways, how he paused before speaking to ensure his words carried thoughtfulness rather than defensiveness, how he engaged with Lily not as a child to be guided, but as a perceptive, thoughtful individual whose voice mattered and whose courage had sparked a transformation, and how he approached me with renewed attentiveness, willingness, and emotional presence, each action reinforcing the bonds that had once been frayed by silence, fear, and avoidance, creating a delicate, living fabric of trust and understanding that was now interwoven into the foundation of our home. I too felt the depth of change within myself, the growth of patience, the willingness to listen before judging, the ability to reflect on my own shortcomings without self-reproach, and the recognition that nurturing a family is a continuous, conscious practice, not a responsibility fulfilled only in grand gestures or in moments of crisis, but in the everyday presence, attentiveness, and gentle courage required to maintain connection, empathy, and mutual respect.
Everyday life became infused with subtle rituals that carried deeper significance than I could have imagined. Meals shared not out of obligation, but as moments of attention and dialogue. Evenings spent reading, walking, or simply sitting together in reflective silence that spoke more than words could. Laughter shared over small, ordinary occurrences that now held profound resonance because they were experienced within a home that had been consciously rebuilt through trust, honesty, and courage. And I noticed that even moments of disagreement or frustration were now opportunities for dialogue, learning, and emotional growth, rather than sources of fear, tension, or withdrawal, because we had cultivated a practice of acknowledging feelings, listening fully, and responding with care and patience. Lily continued to observe, participate, and teach in her quiet way, her actions and insights shaping our interactions and reminding us that wisdom, courage, and clarity are not confined by age, that even the youngest member of a family can become the catalyst for meaningful, lasting change, and that the smallest acts of bravery, like leaving a folded note, can ripple outward to transform relationships, perceptions, and the emotional climate of an entire household. I often thought about the way a single gesture, small and seemingly fragile, had carried the power to illuminate hidden truths, foster dialogue, and ignite the ongoing process of reconciliation. And I marveled at the resilience, intelligence, and emotional acuity of my daughter, whose courage had been both the spark and the compass guiding us towards healing and understanding. I also reflected on the broader lessons of this journey, the quiet wisdom that emerges when a family faces its challenges with honesty, patience, and empathy. I realized that mistakes, misunderstandings, and hidden truths are not failures to be punished or avoided, but opportunities to grow, to listen, and to learn, if approached with care, intentionality, and the willingness to remain open, vulnerable, and reflective. The note had reminded me that courage is often subtle, that love is an ongoing practice rather than a static emotion, and that the willingness to acknowledge truth, even when difficult, creates space for connection, understanding, and reconciliation that can endure far longer than anger, denial, or avoidance ever could. I saw this play out not only in our words and actions, but in the atmosphere of our home, which now felt lighter, warmer, and more alive with presence, attentiveness, and mutual respect. A home in which laughter, conversation, and quiet reflection could coexist, and in which each family member had the space to grow, be heard, and be valued for both their strength and their vulnerability. Looking back, I understood that the journey from tension, secrecy, and unspoken burdens to understanding, connection, and healing was not linear or simple. It required patience, reflection, courage, and ongoing effort. But it was worth every moment, every difficult conversation, and every quiet choice to listen, respond with empathy, and act intentionally. I marveled at how our lives had shifted, not because a single dramatic event solved everything, but because the spark of honesty and courage ignited a process of transformation that was sustained through conscious effort, reflection, and care, creating a foundation for lasting emotional resilience and meaningful relationships. Daniel and I, Lily and I, and all three of us together had learned that family is not about perfection, about silence, or about pretending that mistakes or difficult truths do not exist. Family is about presence, courage, honesty, and the repeated deliberate choices to foster connection, trust, and understanding in the face of difficulty, misunderstanding, or fear. And it was in these choices that the deepest, most enduring form of love resides. In quiet moments now, I often sit and watch my daughter, noticing the subtle ways she interacts, listens, observes, and offers insight. And I feel both awe and gratitude, recognizing that her bravery and intelligence shaped the entire trajectory of our family, teaching lessons that could not have been learned through any other means. I watch Daniel and feel gratitude for his willingness to speak, to reflect, and to participate fully in the work of healing and rebuilding. And I watch myself with compassion and pride, understanding that my own growth, the ability to listen, reflect, and act with patience and empathy, was both necessary and ongoing. The home feels alive now with presence, attentiveness, and mutual respect, filled with small, meaningful moments that carry a profound weight because they are grounded in the work we have done together, in honesty, courage, and intentionality. And I understand that this is the quiet power of resolution, a change that does not erase the past but transforms it into wisdom, empathy, and connection, guiding a family forward into a future shaped by love, awareness, and conscious care. And so as I close my reflection on this journey, I feel a calm, enduring warmth, the sense that while challenges will inevitably arise, the bonds we have rebuilt, strengthened by honesty, courage, and empathy, provide a foundation that can carry us through any difficulty. The note that once seemed so small now feels monumental. A reminder that bravery comes in many forms, that love requires attention and practice, and that even the quietest acts of honesty and insight can ripple outward to transform not only relationships, but the very heart of a home. I have learned that resolution is not a final destination, but a living, ongoing practice, one that demands awareness, patience, and intentionality. And I am grateful for the opportunity to walk this path, guided by the courage of my daughter, the reflection and openness of my partner, and the willingness of all of us to embrace truth, listen deeply, and nurture love with care, consistency, and heart.